And now we are on page 36 and 37. There are 2 pages here, but do be careful. You will want to, again, turn the C into an A, the D becomes a B, the E becomes a C. The computer, again, did not want to put this in the right order that it appears on the screen. So change the order around so that you have battles in the West starting at the beginning. I did trim off the idea that it's continued and put it at the bottom of page 36 because I wanted as much of the picture to show as I could on page 37. Once you have that set up, you might want to pause the video to get it set up and then hit play because I will tell you another story. So hopefully you're ready to hear the story now. The first thing you need to know and think about is the fact that most of the battles in the Revolutionary War happened in the East, along the Atlantic Ocean. The first reason for that is there were more towns in that area. What were some of those towns that would be military targets? We had Boston. We had Philly, Philadelphia. We had New York City, just to name a few. So those were better targets, and the British could get to them by boat. Remember, we just talked about the fact that the British have the best navy in the world. Given that fact, we still did have the nations of England and America and the Indians. Each of the Indian tribes was considered a separate nation, and each of the Indian tribes was recruited as allies by both the Continental Army and England. The Indians mostly allied with the English. The reason for that is they thought the British would be able to keep the Americans off Indian land. There was a fellow, a British officer, and he's the one you're seeing in the picture here. He was in charge of the West for the British. His nickname was Hamilton the Hair Buyer. And this gets a little bit on the gross side, but it's the idea that this picture is showing you. Hamilton gave his British allies not just permission, but he encouraged them to attack settlements of the colonists. Not to join him in battles against the army, but to go find log cabins that happened to be out alone in the woods, or smaller little settlements, smaller groups of log cabins. He encouraged the Indians to attack them, the ones that were allied with him, and then he paid those Indians for the scalps of anyone that they killed and scalped in those attacks. This is why he was called the hair buyer. This made things really, really awful on the frontier because women and children who had stayed home to look after the farms became targets since Hamilton was willing to pay for their scalps. The Americans were very concerned about this. George Washington got a fellow named, I'll skip this map for a second, named George Rogers Clark. Now you will hear much more about George Rogers Clark's famous younger brother than you do about George Rogers Clark. George Rogers Clark was active in the Revolutionary War. He had a group of frontiersmen, and he went and gathered them together, and he marched from the forks of the Ohio River. They went down the Ohio River, gathered more people sort of at the end of the Ohio River, and then got themselves up to Kaskaskia, attacked a fort there, and marched overland. This is the part that we're going to talk about in a minute, and this is a part that the picture shows you, this overland march. He did this march in the winter, he and the men, because they wanted to surprise Hamilton at Vincennes. Why would that be a surprise? Well, it was over 200 miles, and as part of that march, he and the men had to cross 4 freezing rivers. They were not frozen solid, so you can see this was not a pleasant march. The reason Clark and his men were willing to do this is they knew Hamilton up in Vincennes had sent all his Indian allies out on a raid because they did not expect an attack in February. So there were few men in the fort with Hamilton the hair buyer at Vincennes. As Clark and his men got closer to Vincennes, he also marched them in such a way that they would march behind the hills that hid them from the view of the fort. And then the men at the front of the line go and get in the back of the line, so it looked like a longer line marching up to the fort. So the people in the fort would be looking out. They would count the men that they could see in between the hills. What they didn't realize is they were counting the same men 2 and 3 times. Then at night, Hamilton had his men shoot the guards through the loopholes. How were they able to do this? Well, it was an incredibly delicate maneuver because this is all the larger a loophole is. You would put your rifle barrel through there and you would fire out. It wasn't thought that your enemies could hit you by firing in. However, these men with George Rogers Clark, because they lived on the frontier, they were such good shots, they were able to make that shot. Now, there were some interesting connections between this battle and Fort Michilimackinac on the tip of Michigan's Lower Peninsula. In fact, you can visit a rebuilt Fort Michilimackinac. This fort was one of the few places in Michigan that's connected to the Revolutionary War. Once George Rogers Clark beat Hamilton and Vincennes had to surrender, word of this got back to Fort Michilimackinac. The commander at Fort Michilimackinac was so freaked out by this report that he had the entire fort taken down and moved to Mackinac Island. So there is a wonderful Michigan connection. The colonial Fort Michilimackinac has been rebuilt. You can see right there is the Mackinac Bridge. See if it lets me zoom in enough. No, of course it isn't. There's the Mackinac Bridge in the background. If you have never gone to visit Fort Michilimackinac, the colonial fort on the mainland, it's the last exit before you get off, before going over the Mackinac Bridge. It is an awesome place to visit. They have like a walk up here at the top of the fort walls. You can walk around walls. You can go inside all of the buildings. There is an archaeological dig that is ongoing, and you can put on the clothes of a British officer and a French trapper. And that's my daddy and my mama who went up there with me that time I took the pictures. So it's just an awesome place to go. But the consequences, the results of George Rogers Clark winning at Fort Vincennes, they reverberated all the way up here at the tip of Michigan. So George Rogers Clark won this battle at Vincennes. Colonial Fort Michilimackinac was taken down and moved to Mackinac Island as a result. There are some other bigger picture results as well. In the short term, the Indian allies became less reliable for the British. They realized that since Hamilton had lost, they probably couldn't count on the British to be able to protect them. This seems like a small and unimportant victory compared to the whole war, but here's the big idea. In the long term, when the Continental Army wins the war, the Revolutionary War, and sits down in Paris to negotiate the treaty, we were able to say we should get all of the land west of the Mississippi River because we won this battle. Or west to the Mississippi River. Sorry, I misspoke. So because of this one battle right here, we were able to claim all of the land west to the Mississippi River. Pretty important battle, even though it didn't seem so at the time. So that's a really interesting consequence of this one battle in the West. These are just some other interesting things that you can see at Fort Michilimackinac. And then I will remind you for today, be sure that you have colored this picture and that you have the notes on page 37, that you have the notes on page 36 about battles in the West. Be sure that you have the quote of John Paul Jones and color the picture of John Paul Jones. Make sure you have copied the notes from the video about the war at sea. And we'll go to the front. The war at sea was on page 34 and 35. The battles out west were on pages 36 and 37. You also need to be sure that you have written down the quote for John Paul Jones, "I have not yet begun to fight." And one last thing to reinforce how important the battle at Vincennes was. So the battle at Vincennes happened right here, and all of this land was able to be negotiated into the treaty as part of the United States. Very important to us in Michigan. That was a long-term consequence of the battle at Vincennes. Be sure that your booklet is all set for today, and that's social studies.